Metal groaned under the relentless pressure, a sound exactly like a dying animal choking on its own blood. Oxygen scrubbers rattled, spitting the taste of copper and stale sweat into the freezing bunker. Rescue wasn't a word they used anymore. It was a fairy tale for children who hadn't seen the orbital batteries silence the communication array. They were waiting to die in the dark, but the void doesn't just hold death. Sometimes, it spits out something infinitely angrier than the monsters scratching at the door. Dust sifted from the cracked concrete ceiling, catching the dim, bloody glow of the emergency lumen strips. Arthur watched a single speck spiral downward, mapping its trajectory until it landed on the back of his trembling, grease-stained hand. He wiped it away, smearing a mixture of hydraulic fluid and someone else's dried blood across his knuckles. Cold permeated everything. It wasn't the crisp, biting cold of a winter morning back on Earth, a planet Arthur had never even seen. It was the sterile, indifferent cold of a failing life support system. It tasted like tin and smelled of burnt insulation, mingling horribly with the sharp, acidic reek of fierce sweat and necrotic flesh. Across the cramped, subterranean room, Chloe sat back on her heels, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She was a hydro engineer by trade, but for the last 48 hours, she had been a combat medic. She looked awful. Her dirty blonde hair was matted to her skull, and the bags beneath her eyes were purple, swollen like fresh bruises. Beneath her bloody hands lay Miller. He was 19, a junior surveyor who had been on his first off-world rotation. Now, he was missing the lower half of his left leg, and the cauterized stump was weeping a yellowish fluid that made Arthur's stomach churn. "His pulse is threading," Chloe muttered. Her voice was flat, devoid of the frantic panic that had characterized her tone 2 days ago. Panic required energy, and they were entirely out of calories. Arthur didn't reply immediately. He went back to stripping the casing off a frayed copper wire with his teeth. It tasted bitter, coated in a fine layer of pulverized rock. He spat a fleck of plastic onto the grating beneath his boots. "Keep the tourniquet tight," he finally said, his voice raspy, catching on the dryness in his throat. "Don't waste the morph stims. If he wakes up, let him scream." It was a callous thing to say, and a part of Arthur hated himself for it. He wanted to be the comforting father figure, the stoic leader who promised them they would all go home, but he couldn't force the lie past his teeth. The truth was written in the vibrations shaking the floorboards every 4 minutes. Thump! A rhythmic, bone-jarring impact rattled the loose tools on Arthur's workbench. The Varrock. They weren't using explosive ordnance anymore. They were using kinetic rams, physically pounding the triple-reinforced titanium airlock of the bunker into scrap. It was an industrial, methodical execution. The Varrock didn't negotiate, they didn't take prisoners, and they certainly didn't care about the 60 unarmed miners trapped in the sublevels of Aegis Prime. Arthur looked down at the pathetic mass of circuitry in his lap. It was a shortwave distress beacon. He had been trying to patch the primary transceiver for 6 hours, working with stripped wires and a soldering iron that barely held a charge. Why was he doing it? The math was incredibly simple, and Arthur was a pragmatic man. The airlock would breach in roughly 3 hours. The remaining oxygen would become toxic in 4. Even if he got a signal out, the nearest Allied fleet outpost was a 3-week slip jump away. He was fixing the radio because if he stopped moving his hands, his brain would catch up with his reality. If he stopped twisting wires together, he would have to acknowledge the cold, hard fact that he was going to be eaten alive by heavily armored, 6-limbed xenomorphs in the dark. "I'm thirsty," Miller wheezed from the floor. His voice was incredibly small, a brittle reed snapping in the heavy silence. Chloe looked at Arthur, a silent, desperate question. Arthur shook his head. "No water," he said, forcing his eyes back to the circuit board. "We're out." "I know you have the flask, Arthur," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, jagged whisper. "I saw you tuck it into your rig." Arthur's hand instinctively brushed his hip. He felt the cold curve of the metal flask beneath his heavy canvas jacket. It held maybe 3 mouthfuls of recycled grey water. He had been saving it. For what? For his own dying moments. To wash down the cyanide capsule he didn't have. The sheer selfishness of it curled in his gut, acidic and shameful. He wasn't a hero. He was a terrified, selfish, ordinary man trying to squeeze a few more miserable seconds out of a doomed existence. "Give it to him," Chloe demanded, rising slightly, her wrench clattering against the grating. Arthur met her gaze. He saw the frayed edges of her sanity, the manic desperation clinging to her retinas. Slowly, wordlessly, he reached into his jacket, unclipped the flask, and tossed it to her. She caught it clumsily, nearly dropping it before unscrewing the cap and lifting Miller's head to press the rim to his cracked lips. Thump! The bunker shuddered harder this time. A shower of concrete dust and rusted flakes rained down, coating the terminal screens in grey snow. The overhead lights flickered, died for 3 terrifying seconds, and then snapped back on, noticeably dimmer. Arthur threw the useless circuit board onto the table. The sharp crack of plastic hitting metal was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. He dragged a hand down his face, feeling the grit and the heavy, coarse stubble on his jaw. There was no rescue coming. The galaxy was too wide, the bureaucracy too slow, and humanity too spread out to care about a tiny mining outpost on a barren rock at the edge of the Perseus Veil. They were a rounding error in a corporate ledger. He reached under the workbench and pulled out the heavy plasma cutter. It was designed to shear through dense silicate deposits, not chitinous armor, but it was heavy and it could burn. He checked the battery cell. 30%, enough for a few minutes of desperate, screaming violence before the end. He rested the heavy, unwieldy tool across his knees, staring blankly at the massive, dented steel doors at the end of the corridor. "How long?" Chloe asked, dropping the empty flask. She didn't look at him. She was staring at her own blood-stained hands, tracing the lines of dried gore in her palms. "Soon," Arthur said softly. The cynical, bitter part of his brain wanted to laugh. It was entirely absurd. Decades of human expansion, trillions of credits spent on faster-than-light travel and terraforming, and it all ended here, in a damp hole, waiting for the door to break. Vibrations traveled up through the soles of Arthur's boots, no longer the rhythmic thumping of the kinetic rams, but a continuous, high-pitched squeal of shearing metal. The outer airlock seals were screaming. The sound was physical, a localized ache that nestled directly behind his eyes. "They're through the secondary blast doors," Arthur said. He didn't yell. The acoustics of the bunker amplified the flat, defeated timbre of his voice. He stood up, his knees popping, and hoisted the plasma cutter. It was heavy, poorly balanced, and the grip was already slick with his own cold, clammy sweat. Chloe didn't say a word. She gently laid Miller's head back onto his folded jacket, stood up, and picked up her heavy hydro spanner. It was a pathetic weapon, a blunt instrument of desperate defiance against alien monstrosities bred for slaughter. Yet the way she gripped it, knuckles white and jaw locked tight, spoke of a deeply ingrained, completely irrational human refusal to simply lay down and die. The screeching from the corridor intensified, echoing off the concrete walls. Beneath the tearing metal, a new sound emerged, the frantic, wet clicking of mandibles and the rapid scurry of heavy, clawed limbs on steel grating. The Varrock were inside the facility. They were swarming the tunnels, smelling the heat and the blood of the trapped survivors. Arthur flipped the toggle on the plasma cutter. It hummed to life, a vibrating weight in his hands that smelled intensely of ozone and burning dust. He aimed the heavy nozzle at the primary doors. "Get behind me, Chloe. When the door drops, aim for the joints in their legs. If they get close, they'll gut you before you can swing." He was giving tactical advice he had no business giving. He was an engineer who fixed water purifiers, not a marine. The heavy steel door buckled inward with a deafening crack. A massive, jagged dent appeared right in the center, the metal tearing to reveal a sliver of total darkness beyond. A foul odor wafted through the breach, a sickening mixture of ammonia, rotting meat, and the harsh chemical propellant of Varrock weaponry. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was hyperventilating, his breaths shallow and ragged. He wanted to run. Every primal instinct screamed at him to turn his back, find a dark corner, and curl into a fetal position. He gritted his teeth so hard his jaw ached, forcing his boots to stay planted. The door groaned, preparing to give way entirely. Then the world tilted. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a kinetic impact. It was a fundamental, nauseating shift in reality itself. Arthur's stomach lurched violently into his throat, exactly like the sensation of cresting a steep hill on a roller coaster. But it didn't end. The air pressure in the bunker dropped so rapidly, his ears popped with a painful crack. The water in Miller's spilled flask defied gravity for a split second, rising into tiny, suspended droplets before slapping back against the grating. A sound followed. It defied description, a subterranean, guttural roar that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the atmosphere, vibrating not just in the air, but in the fillings of Arthur's teeth and the marrow of his bones. It was the horrific, violent noise of a massive object displacing space-time far too close to a planetary gravity well. The Varrock scratching at the door stopped. The sudden silence from the alien swarm was more jarring than their attack. The furious clicking and tearing halted abruptly, replaced by a confused, agitated chittering that drifted through the breached steel. Arthur lowered the plasma cutter a fraction of an inch, exchanging a bewildered, terrified glance with Chloe. She looked pale, clutching her stomach as the localized gravity wave continued to induce extreme vertigo. On the far wall, A single, miraculously surviving telemetry monitor flickered to life. It was tied to the exterior atmospheric sensors, currently showing a heavily distorted, static-laced feed of the sky above Aegis Prime. Arthur stumbled toward the console, dragging his boots across the grating. He slammed a heavy fist against the side of the monitor, a desperate mechanic's trick, and the static cleared just enough to show the low orbit of the planet. The sky was literally bleeding. A massive tear in the void hung directly above the mining colony, radiating violently purple and black energies. It was a slip-space rupture, but it was entirely wrong. It was ragged, unstable, bleeding Cherenkov radiation into the atmosphere. Commercial and standard military vessels entered real space cleanly, sliding through the dimensional barrier like a scalpel. This was not a scalpel. This was a sledgehammer smashing through a pane of glass. Out of the boiling cosmic wound tore a shape of absolute brutalist nightmare. It was unimaginably massive, blocking out the local sun. It possessed no sleek curves, no elegant alien geometry, no aerodynamic grace. It was a flying brick, a colossal, jagged slab of matte gray ablative armor, heavily scarred and scorched black by centuries of orbital re-entry and hard vacuum combat. It bristled with an insane array of magnetic accelerator cannons, point defense turrets, and heavy torpedo tubes. It was ugly, it was functional, it was dripping with naked, unadulterated aggression. Along the scarred flank of the monolithic dreadnought, a massive emblem was painted in faded, chipped white paint, the archaic, unmistakable silhouette of a stylized Earth, flanked by a sword and a wrench. "United Terran?" Chloe breathed, her voice a hollow, disbelieving whisper, her wrench slipping from her fingers to clatter loudly on the floor. Arthur stared at the screen, his chest heaving. He wasn't filled with a sudden burst of heroic joy. He felt a jarring, painful shock to his system. He had accepted death. He had made peace with the cold, dark end. Now, this gargantuan monument to human violence had violently ripped him back into the terrifying realm of hope. The dreadnought didn't broadcast a warning. It didn't demand surrender. Dozens of heavy hatches blew off the underside of the vessel, raining down toward the surface like discarded scales. From the dark bays, hundreds of tungsten-tipped drop pods shot downward, leaving thick white contrails in the thin atmosphere, streaking toward the Varak siege lines like the fiery wrath of an angry, forgotten god. Humanity hadn't just answered the distress call. They had come to break the planet in half. Seismic waves hit them before the sound did. It felt as though Aegis Prime itself had been struck by a colossal hammer. Arthur's knees buckled under the violent oscillation of the floorboards, throwing him hard against the edge of his workbench. The heavy plasma cutter slipped from his grip, clattering uselessly into the darkness. Above them, the reinforced concrete ceiling groaned, raining thick sheets of grey dust and flaking rust. Then came the noise. It wasn't an explosion. Explosions were finite. This was a continuous overlapping roar of atmospheric friction and kinetic impacts. Tungsten slugs, weighing 3 tons apiece, were slamming into the bedrock above at terminal velocity. The air pressure in the bunker rapidly fluctuated, popping Arthur's eardrums and sending a sharp spike of pain directly into his sinuses. He curled into a tight ball on the grating, clamping his filthy hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut as the entire subterranean facility threatened to collapse under the sheer violence of their rescue. Across the cramped space, Chloe had thrown herself over Miller, shielding the unconscious boy's face with her own jacket. Her shoulders shook violently, though whether from terror or the physical vibrations of the bombardment, Arthur couldn't tell. He tried to yell to her to ask if she was intact, but his voice was completely swallowed by the apocalyptic thunder rolling through the rock. Outside, the buckled steel of the airlock, the horrific chittering of the Varak swarm shifted into a chaotic frenzy. The predators were suddenly prey. Their scratching and tearing at the door ceased entirely, replaced by high-pitched, wet screeches of confusion. The hunters had felt the ground shatter beneath them. Arthur opened his eyes, blinking through the thick, choking cloud of pulverized silicate that filled the room. The emergency lumens were barely glowing, casting long, grotesque shadows. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, tasting copper and ash on his tongue. He hacked, spitting a thick wad of grey saliva onto the grating. His ribs ached where he had hit the bench, a dull, throbbing reminder of his own fragility. Through the jagged tear in the center of the blast door, the impenetrable darkness of the corridor was suddenly illuminated by stroboscopic flashes of blinding, abrasive light. It wasn't the clean, focused beams of mining lasers. It was the harsh, yellow-white muzzle flash of chemically propelled heavy munitions. A sound like ripping canvas tore through the corridor, impossibly loud and impossibly fast. But it was a rotary cannon firing depleted uranium rounds in a confined space. The shrieks of the alien swarm turned into wet, concussive thuds. The heavy-caliber rounds weren't just piercing the chitinous armor of the Varrock, they were detonating the creatures, turning the heavily armored, six-limbed nightmares into aerosolized gore. Hot, foul-smelling liquid splashed against the outside of the bunker door, seeping through the breach and dripping onto the floor in thick, viscous pools. The smell of ammonia and rotting meat was instantly overpowered by the sharp, metallic tang of cordite, burnt ozone, and vaporized copper. Arthur scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the slick grating, his hands desperately searching the floor for the plasma cutter. He found the heavy handle, clutching it to his chest like a talisman, though he knew it was utterly useless against whatever was currently butchering the monsters outside. "Arthur!" Chloe screamed, her voice barely piercing the ringing in his ears. She was pointing at the heavy steel door. The dented metal was glowing an angry cherry red around the hinges. Someone, or something, was cutting through the locks from the outside. The heat radiating into the room was immediate and oppressive, a dry baking wave that curled the edges of the technical manuals scattered on the floor. "Get back!" Arthur rasped, his throat raw. He dragged himself backward, wedging his shoulders against the cold rock of the rear wall. He aimed the plasma cutter at the glowing door, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold the heavy tool straight. A localized, shaped charge detonated against the reinforced hinges. The concussive wave blew the massive steel doors entirely off their housing. 2 tons of titanium-reinforced metal slammed into the bunker floor, skidding violently forward and crushing Arthur's workbench into twisted scrap. A tidal wave of grey smoke, heat, and the coppery stench of blood flooded the room, instantly choking the remaining oxygen. Arthur squeezed the trigger of the plasma cutter. Nothing happened. The battery had shaken loose when he dropped it. He was holding a dead piece of metal. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable, visceral tearing of claws and teeth. Heavy boots crunched onto the fallen steel door. "Clear right!" a voice barked. It was distorted, amplified through external helmet speakers, carrying a flat, digitized and utterly exhausted baritone. Arthur opened his eyes. A towering silhouette stepped through the thick smoke. The figure was clad in matte grey ablative combat armor that was heavily scarred, pitted with acid burns, and streaked with alien blood. It wasn't a sleek, robotic soldier. It was bulky, utilitarian, and visibly worn. Thick servo motors whirred with an audible, gritty grind at the joints. An assault rifle, roughly the size of Arthur's entire leg, was tucked tightly into the figure's shoulder, sweeping the room with a laser sight that cut through the dust like a solid crimson wire. A second figure followed, stepping fluidly over the debris, their weapons sweeping the left corner. They moved with a terrifying, predatory efficiency, their heavy boots making no sound other than the crushing of loose concrete. "Contact, non-combatants," the first figure stated, lowering the massive rifle just a fraction of an inch. A heavy armored hand reached up and unlatched the front plate of the helmet. With a hiss of depressurization, the visor lifted, revealing a human face. It was a man in his late 30s, his skin pale and slick with sweat, a deep, jagged scar cutting through a thick layer of dark stubble on his jaw. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark circles of profound fatigue, and they locked onto Arthur with the dead, hollow stare of someone who had spent a lifetime wading through slaughter. "United Terran Marine Corps," the man grunted, his voice devoid of any heroic inflection, tasting of stale recaf and adrenaline. He spat a wad of dark phlegm onto the floor. "You the chief engineer?" Flashlights cut through the particulate fog, thick beams of aggressive white light intersecting over Miller's unconscious body. The second Marine, noticeably smaller but carrying a massive medical pack strapped to their heavy armor, bypassed Arthur completely. They dropped to their knees beside Chloe, the metal plating of their greaves slamming into the grating with a heavy, unceremonious thud. "Move!" the medic ordered. It wasn't a request. The voice was female, sharp and raspy. Chloe, still clutching Miller's torn jacket, hesitated, her eyes wide, locked in a state of traumatized paralysis. A heavy armored hand gripped Chloe's shoulder and physically shoved her backward against the wall. It was a rough, jarring motion, lacking any bedside manner. "I said move," the medic repeated, already tearing open a hard-shell medical kit. She didn't look at Chloe again. Her hands, encased in tactical gloves stained with old gore, flew across Miller's crushed leg. Arthur watched, his back pressed against the freezing rock wall, his lungs burning with the acrid smoke. He wanted to stand, to assert some kind of authority, to ask a dozen frantic questions. Instead, his legs simply refused to hold his weight. He slid down the wall until he was sitting in a puddle of hydraulic fluid, his hands shaking uselessly in his lap. The adrenaline that had kept him functioning for the last 48 hours evaporated in a single, sickening rush, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing exhaustion that made his teeth chatter. "Heart rate is 50 and dropping," the medic barked, pulling a thick, syringe-like device from her kit. It didn't have a needle. It had a blunt metallic nozzle. "Blood loss is massive. Cauterization failed. Applying biofoam." She jammed the nozzle directly into the open wound of Miller's stump. The boy, who had been completely comatose, suddenly arched his back, a horrific, gurgling scream tearing from his throat. The device hissed loudly, injecting a rapidly expanding, bright yellow compound directly into his severed arteries. The foam sizzled, smelling intensely of burning plastic and harsh antiseptics, hardening instantly to seal the massive trauma. Chloe gagged, turning her head away and vomiting a thin string of yellow bile onto the floor. The Marine leader, the one with the scarred jaw, stepped over to Arthur. Up close, the man smelled like a slaughterhouse mixed with an industrial chemical fire. He holstered a heavy sidearm and looked down at the trembling engineer. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. "Sergeant Griggs," the Marine said, his tone utterly flat. He reached into a utility pouch on his chest rig, pulled out a battered aluminum canteen and tossed it. It hit Arthur in the chest, bouncing into his lap. "Drink, slowly. Don't puke it up. We don't have time to wait for you." Arthur stared at the canteen. His hands shook so violently, he could barely unscrew the cap. When he finally brought it to his lips, the water was lukewarm and tasted heavily of iodine, but it was the greatest thing he had ever consumed. He swallowed agonizingly, his dehydrated throat convulsing, trying to draw moisture into his cracked tissues. "How many?" Griggs asked, sweeping his flashlight over the destroyed machinery of the bunker. "Just us," Arthur croaked, the words tearing at his vocal cords. "The others, sub-level 4. They got trapped when the ventilation collapsed." Griggs didn't flinch. He didn't show an ounce of sorrow. He just tapped a button on the side of his helmet. "Actual, this is Alpha 2. We have 3 survivors in the pump station. Rest of the colony is scrubbed. We are Oscar Mike to Extraction Point Delta." A burst of static answered him, followed by a voice so distorted by interference it sounded like gravel grinding in a blender. "Copy, Alpha 2. Orbital bombardment shifting to Grid 7. You have a 4-minute window before we glass the sector. Get moving." "You heard the man," Griggs said, turning back to the medic. "Foster, is the kid transportable?" Foster was already strapping a rigid, mechanized splint over the hardened biofoam on Miller's leg. "He's stabilized, but if we jostle him too hard, the foam will crack. He needs a med bay 10 minutes ago. He's getting a walk in the park," Griggs grunted. He reached down, grabbed the tactical webbing on Foster's back, and helped haul the heavily armored medic to her feet. "Grab his shoulders. I've got his legs." "Wait," Arthur gasped, finally finding the strength to push himself off the floor. His knees popped in protest. "You're carrying him? What about a stretcher? A hover gurney?" Griggs paused, turning slowly to look at Arthur. The Marine's bloodshot eyes held a terrifying, cold exhaustion. "We dropped from orbit in a titanium box going Mach 7 into a hostile landing zone, Chief. We didn't bring the luxury luggage." The harsh reality slapped Arthur across the face. This wasn't a sterilized hospital rescue. This was a smash and grab violently executed in the middle of an alien meat grinder. Griggs and Foster hoisted Miller into the air, the boy groaning weakly as the biofoam set locked his hip in place. "Grab the hydro-engineer," Griggs ordered Arthur, nodding toward Chloe, who was still leaning against the wall, dry heaving into her hands. "Keep her moving. If she stops, leave her." Arthur's stomach churned at the brutality of the command. But he knew Griggs wasn't being cruel. He was stating the mathematics of their survival. The clock was ticking. Arthur stumbled over to Chloe, grabbing her by the back of her dirty jacket and pulling her upright. She felt incredibly light, frail, like a bundle of hollow bones. "Come on," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "We're going home, Chloe. Just walk." Griggs kicked the remaining debris of the blast door out of the way, stepping out into the darkened corridor. The heavy strobe of the distant rotary cannon had stopped, replaced by the eerie, localized silence of a freshly slaughtered battlefield. Arthur guided Chloe through the breached doorway, stepping over the threshold. His boots sank into something soft and wet. He looked down. The corridor, once clean, grey ferrocrete, was painted in thick swaths of viscous, dark, purple fluid. The bodies of the Varak, dozens of them, were piled against the walls, ripped into jagged, unrecognizable shapes by high-caliber munitions. Chitinous plating lay shattered like broken glass, mixed with heavy shell casings that were still smoking, searing crescent moon brands into the floor. The stench of butchered meat was so overpowering it made Arthur's eyes water violently. "Eyes forward, Chief," Griggs called back over his shoulder, his boots crushing through the horrific carpet of alien remains without hesitation. "Don't look at the mess. Just follow the boots." Arthur swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He wrapped his arm tight around Chloe's waist, dragging her forward into the slaughter, stepping directly in the bloody, oversized footprints of the monsters that had come to save them. Panic was a luxury Arthur couldn't afford, yet it coated the back of his throat like thick, suffocating ash. His boots skidded on the grated floor, finding no purchase in the slick, purple viscera that painted the corridor. Every step required a conscious, agonizing effort. He wasn't a soldier. He was a maintenance engineer, whose heaviest lifting usually involved recalibrating water filtration pumps. Now he was hauling a traumatized, half-starved hydro-engineer through an alien abattoir, chasing the backs of two sociopathic giants in power armor. "Keep up, Chief," Griggs grunted over the helmet's external speaker. The Marine didn't turn around. He and Foster were moving at a brutal, relentless pace, carrying the unconscious Miller between them like a sack of synthetic grain. The biofoam locking Miller's stump in place glowed faintly in the dim emergency lighting, a sickening neon yellow against the drab, bloody grey of the tunnel. Arthur dug his fingers tighter into the canvas of Chloe's jacket. She was stumbling, her boots dragging uselessly, her chin tucked against her chest. She was hyperventilating, her breaths coming in ragged, high-pitched hitches. "I can't," Chloe whimpered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical whine of the Marine's servos and the distant, rhythmic thuds of orbital artillery pounding the surface above. "Arthur, I'm slipping." "You are not stopping," Arthur rasped, his own lungs burning with a fierce, acidic fire. His muscles screamed, completely depleted of glycogen, running on nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. "Move your legs, Chloe. Do not look at the floor. Look at the armor. Just look at the armor." It was terrible advice, but it was all he had. The floor was a nightmare. They were passing through the primary transit artery of Sub-Level 2, and it had been transformed into a meat grinder. The Varrock had used this corridor to funnel their numbers toward the bunker, and the Marines had simply walked straight down the center, holding down their triggers. Chunks of chitin, severed limbs, and acidic internal fluids were sprayed across the walls in morbid, abstract patterns. The smell was beyond description, a putrid blend of rotting fish, raw sewage, and the sharp, metallic tang of spent uranium casings. Arthur's eyes watered so heavily his vision blurred, turning the carnage into a smudged, violet-hued painting. Above them, the ceiling groaned violently. Dust rained down in thick sheets, coating the gore in a layer of grey silicate. The 4-minute window Griggs had mentioned was ticking away in Arthur's skull, an invisible metronome pacing their frantic march. 3 minutes. A sudden, wet hiss echoed off the concrete to their left. Arthur snapped his head toward the sound, his blood turning to ice. Half buried under a collapsed ventilation duct lay a surviving Varrock. It was missing its 2 lower legs, the stumps leaking thick purple sludge, but its upper torso was intact. Its 4 remaining limbs scratched frantically at the grating, dragging its massive, armored bulk forward. Its mandibles clicked in a furious rhythmic cadence, and its multiple black, compound eyes locked directly onto Chloe. It lunged, a desperate thrashing burst of pure predatory instinct. Arthur froze. His brain simply stopped processing. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't pull Chloe away. He was paralyzed by the sudden, violent reality of a monster closing the distance, its jaws opening to reveal concentric rings of razor-sharp, inward-facing teeth. Crack! A single deafening gunshot shattered the heavy air in the corridor. The Varrock's head snapped back, violently exploding outward in a shower of black shell and purple tissue. The massive creature collapsed, sliding forward on its own momentum until its twitching mandibles came to a rest less than 2 feet from Arthur's boot. Arthur flinched backward, nearly dropping Chloe. He looked up. Griggs hadn't broken stride. He hadn't stopped walking, and he certainly hadn't let go of Miller. The Marine had simply drawn his heavy sidearm with his free hand, pivoted his torso slightly, fired a single round directly into the alien's cranium, and holstered the weapon in one fluid, mechanical motion. "Keep moving," Griggs repeated, his voice utterly devoid of adrenaline or relief. It was the tone of a man sweeping dust off a porch. Bile rose in Arthur's throat, burning his esophagus. He swallowed it down, his hands shaking so violently he nearly lost his grip on Chloe's jacket again. There was no heroism here. There was no triumphant fanfare. The Marines were exterminators, brutally and efficiently sanitizing a workspace, and Arthur and his crew were just the salvage they had been ordered to retrieve. The temperature in the tunnel began to rise sharply. The damp, freezing chill of the failing life support was replaced by a dry, baking heat that sucked the remaining moisture from Arthur's skin. The air tasted burnt, heavy with the smell of vaporized rock and melting metal. "Surface access is compromised," Foster announced, her voice clipping over the tactical frequency. She was staring at a heads-up display projected on the inside of her visor. "Primary elevator shaft collapsed. Auxiliary stairwell is blocked by heavy slag. Route Bravo!" Griggs ordered instantly. "Through the ore refinement bays. We go out the exhaust vents. That puts us directly under the bombardment grid, Sergeant." "We're already under it," Griggs replied flatly. "Delta is a mile out. We don't have time for a scenic detour." Arthur didn't know what Grid 7 was, but the subtle hesitation in the medic's voice was enough to make his stomach drop. He hauled Chloe tighter against his side, practically carrying her weight now, and forced his burning legs to move faster, chasing the hulking grey silhouettes into the sweltering dark labyrinth of the refinery. Heat hit them like a physical blow when Griggs finally kicked open the rusted grating of the exhaust vent. It wasn't the ambient warmth of a summer day. It was the punishing, suffocating heat of a blast furnace. Arthur dragged Chloe up the final metal rungs, his muscles tearing and cramping, his breath coming in shallow, frantic wheezes. He hauled himself over the lip of the vent and collapsed onto the rocky surface of Aegis Prime, tearing the skin off his knuckles on the jagged basalt. He looked up, and his mind struggled to comprehend the scale of the violence unfolding above him. The sky, once a bruised, dusty violet, was entirely obscured by a boiling canopy of fire and black smoke. The dreadnought still hung in low orbit, an angular, brutalist mountain of grey metal dominating the heavens. But it was no longer dormant. Along its massive flanks, hundreds of battery arrays were flashing in rapid, sequential bursts. Each flash was a kinetic strike. Tungsten rods, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, were slamming into the horizon. There was no sound at first, only blinding stroboscopic flashes of pure white light that burned after-images into Arthur's retinas. A second later, the noise arrived, a rolling apocalyptic thunder that shook the ground so violently Arthur felt his teeth rattling in his skull. The horizon was a jagged wall of fire, towering plumes of vaporized rock and dirt climbing miles into the stratosphere. They were glassing the planet. The Terran fleet wasn't trying to retake Aegis Prime. They were systematically erasing the Varrock infestation, cracking the crust of the planet to boil the aliens in their subterranean nests. "Delta is 600 meters north," Griggs yelled over the deafening roar of the atmosphere. The Marine pointed a heavy, armored finger toward a jagged ridge of black rock. "Move!" Foster and Griggs didn't wait. They hoisted Miller between them and broke into a heavy, ground-eating jog, their armored boots crunching loudly against the fragile crust of the planet. Arthur forced himself to his feet, pulling Chloe up with him. She was entirely non-responsive now, her eyes completely glazed over, staring vacantly at the apocalyptic sky. Arthur slapped her face, a hard, stinging blow to the cheek. "Chloe, walk! Now!" She blinked, the pain snapping her back to reality, just enough to put one foot in front of the other. They ran. It was a pathetic, agonizing stumble compared to the mechanized efficiency of the Marines, but fear is a powerful fuel. The air was thin, choked with thick grey ash that coated their sweaty skin and clogged their throats. Arthur breathed through his teeth, tasting the metallic, ozone-heavy flavor of the orbital bombardment. The heat was unbearable. The very rocks beneath their boots felt like they were radiating a fever. Over the ridge, cutting through the swirling clouds of ash, Arthur saw it. It wasn't a sleek rescue shuttle with medical crosses painted on the side. It was an armored dropship, a brutal, blocky wedge of composite plating and massive turbine engines. It sat idling on the jagged rocks, completely blacked out except for a single, dim red beacon flashing on the lowered rear ramp. Its twin rotary cannons tracked back and forth, automated turrets scanning the smoking craters for movement. 2 minutes. The internal clock in Arthur's head was screaming. They crested the ridge, the dropship only 100 yards away. The thrusters were already whining, building pressure, kicking up a massive storm of dust and loose gravel that blasted Arthur in the face like sandpaper. "Almost there," Arthur gasped, his vision swimming with black spots, his heart hammering against his ribs in a dangerous, erratic rhythm. Suddenly, the ground 50 yards to their left erupted. It wasn't artillery. The crust simply shattered outward upward, vomiting a geyser of pulverized rock and purple slime. From the crater, 3 massive Varrock warriors hauled themselves onto the surface. They were larger than the ones in the tunnels, heavily scarred, their chitinous armor scorched by the orbital heat. They chittered wildly, clicking their mandibles in a deafening, terrifying screech, and charged directly toward the retreating humans. Griggs dropped Miller's legs. Foster took the boy's full weight with a grunt, dragging him backward toward the dropship ramp without missing a beat. Griggs didn't run. He turned, planted his heavy boots in the ash, and raised the massive assault rifle to his shoulder. "Keep going, Chief," Griggs barked, his voice totally steady over the external speakers. Arthur didn't argue. He hooked his arm under Chloe's armpit and dragged her through the gravel, ignoring the burning agony in his calves. Behind him, the air ripped apart. Griggs opened fire. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the rifle was deafening, each depleted uranium round kicking the Marine backward a fraction of an inch, his armor's servos whining in protest as they compensated for the massive recoil. Arthur looked back just as he hit the heavy metal grid of the dropship ramp. The lead Varrock took 3 rounds directly to its center mass. The kinetic force stopped the multi-ton creature dead in its tracks, blowing massive chunks of purple flesh out of its back. It crumpled, sliding through the ash in a tangle of broken limbs. But the other 2 didn't stop. They vaulted over the corpse of their packmate, closing the distance to Griggs with terrifying, unnatural speed. Griggs didn't back up. He simply adjusted his aim, his laser sight cutting a red line through the dust, and kept his finger pinned to the trigger. The brutal, unapologetic violence of the man was awe-inspiring. He wasn't a hero holding the line. He was a worker finishing his shift. Arthur hauled Chloe up the steep ramp, collapsing into the dark, sweltering cargo bay of the dropship. Foster was already strapping Miller onto a steel bench, locking a heavy crash harness over the boy's chest. "Strap in!" Foster screamed at Arthur, throwing a tangle of webbing at his face. "We have 40 seconds before the dreadnought glasses this grid." Arthur scrambled, his bloody fingers fumbling with the heavy steel buckles. He slammed the harness over Chloe, locking her in, then threw himself into the adjacent seat, pulling the webbing tight across his own chest. Outside, the heavy thumping of Griggs's rifle abruptly stopped. A split second later, the massive, armored form of the sergeant sprinted up the ramp, his chest plate smoking, streaked with fresh alien blood. He didn't say a word. He hit the ramp retraction button, throwing himself into a jump seat as the heavy hydraulic doors screamed shut, plunging the bay into darkness. "Punch it," Griggs ordered over the internal comms. The dropship didn't lift off. It was violently yanked into the sky. The G-force hit Arthur like a physical blow, crushing his chest, forcing the air out of his lungs in a pained wheeze. As they tore upward through the atmosphere, the hull groaning in protest, the world outside the reinforced viewing slit turned completely white. Grid 7 ceased to exist. Gravity became a physical weapon. The ascent ripped the air from Arthur's lungs, pressing an invisible, crushing weight against his sternum. His vision tunneled, the edges bleeding into static as the dropship tore a violent path upward through the rapidly expanding shockwaves of the orbital bombardment. Every joint in the ship screamed, the hull rattling so fiercely that Arthur bit the inside of his cheek. Hot blood immediately flooded his mouth, tasting sharp and metallic. He tried to turn his head toward Chloe, but the G-force locked his neck in place. He could only see her out of his peripheral vision. She was slumped against the webbing, her head lolling sickeningly with the vibrations of the craft. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. The sheer volume of trauma had simply shut her nervous system down, leaving an empty, breathing shell. Opposite them, in the dim, red-washed gloom of the troop bay, the Marines were a study in terrifying indifference. Foster was bracing Miller's biofoam cast with her armored knee, her gloved hands steadily checking the digital readouts on a handheld monitor. Beside her, Griggs had completely ignored the ascent. The sergeant was methodically stripping the receiver of his heavy assault rifle, popping out a warped, smoking bolt carrier group and wiping the carbon scoring onto the thigh plate of his armor. How could he do that? The question circled pointlessly in Arthur's oxygen-starved brain. The planet below them was currently fracturing under the weight of localized extinction. Sub-level 4 and the 40 men and women trapped within it had just been vaporized in a storm of tungsten and plasma, and this man was cleaning his gun. Arthur wanted to feel righteous anger at the coldness of it all. He wanted to scream at Griggs, to demand a moment of silence for the people who had boiled in the dark, but the emotion wouldn't come. All Arthur felt was a hollow, selfish relief that tasted bitterly of cowardice. He was alive. He had left his friends to die, and he was glad it wasn't him. The guilt sat in his stomach like a swallowed stone, heavy and nauseating. "Entering exosphere," The dropship pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, flat and synthesized. "Hold for transition!" The agonizing pressure suddenly vanished, replaced by a momentary, terrifying weightlessness. Arthur's stomach lurched violently. A loose bolt floated past his visor, turning lazily in the zero-gravity environment. The deafening roar of atmospheric friction died instantly, plunging the bay into a silence so profound it left Arthur's ears ringing with phantom screeches. Through the narrow, reinforced viewport behind Griggs's head, Arthur saw Aegis Prime. It was no longer a planet, it was an open wound. Massive, spider-webbing fault lines glowed a violent, angry orange across the crust, visible even from low orbit. Plumes of black ash stretched out into the void, reaching toward the stars like grasping, desperate fingers. The Varric were gone, but the cost was an entire world turned to slag. The ship shuddered slightly as maneuvering thrusters fired, aligning them with the Terran dreadnought. The viewport was immediately eclipsed by a wall of matte grey steel. It was impossible to grasp the true scale of the vessel from this proximity. It was a flying continent, entirely devoid of windows or aesthetic lines. It bristled with communication arrays, sensor spines, and the massive, unblinking barrels of heavy coil guns. Clank! Magnetic grapples seized the dropship, rattling Arthur's teeth. Artificial gravity reasserted itself with a heavy, unceremonious thud, pulling Arthur hard against his crash webbing. The internal pressure equalized, popping his ears with a sharp spike of pain. "Touchdown in Hangar Bay 4, the pilot announced. "Clear to disembark." The red emergency lights switched to a blinding, harsh white. The rear hydraulic ramp began to lower with a grinding metallic shriek. Griggs stood up before the ramp even hit the deck. He didn't check on Arthur. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just racked the charging handle of his reassembled rifle, slapped a fresh magazine into the well, and walked down the ramp into the blinding light outside. Arthur unbuckled his harness with trembling, blood-stained fingers. His legs felt like liquid rubber. He tried to stand and instantly collapsed back into the jump seat, his muscles refusing to fire. He was entirely spent, a battery drained to absolute zero. Foster unclipped Miller from the bench. "Need a gurney," she bellowed, her voice booming out into the open space beyond the ramp. She didn't wait for it. She grabbed the straps of Miller's crash harness, hoisted the unconscious 19-year-old over her armored shoulder with a heavy grunt, and marched out of the ship. Arthur was alone in the bay with Chloe. He reached over, his hand shaking, and pressed the release on her harness. It clicked open. She didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the scarred metal floor, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Chloe," Arthur whispered. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "We're here. We made it." She didn't blink. He leaned closer, wrapping his arm around her frail, shivering shoulders, pulling her gently to her feet. She leaned all her weight against him, a rag doll in a grease-stained jacket. Together, shuffling like two old broken people, they limped toward the light of the open ramp. Industrial noise hit them like a physical wall. The hangar bay of the dreadnought was not a sanctuary. It was a factory of violence running at maximum capacity. The cavernous space was vast enough to house a small city, entirely constructed from riveted steel, exposed conduit, and warning tape. The air was thick, suffocatingly hot, and smelled of aviation fuel, burning plasma coolant, and the sharp, alkaline tang of heavy disinfectants. Arthur paused at the bottom of the ramp, squinting through the harsh glare of the overhead floodlights. Massive, armored mechs stomped past, hauling crates of munitions that weighed tons. Sparks rained down from overhead gantries, where technicians in heavy welding rigs were patching the armor of returning strike fighters. It was a chaotic, deafening symphony of human engineering. There were no soft edges here. There were no counselors waiting with blankets and hot cocoa. A medical triage team descended on them instantly. 3 people wearing heavy, blood-spattered aprons over grey fatigue uniforms rushed forward, pushing a heavy hover gurney. They didn't smile. They didn't ask how Arthur was feeling. "Triage tag!" one of them yelled, a burly man with a buzz cut and dark circles under his eyes. "Civilian salvage!" Arthur yelled back over the din of a nearby turbine engine spooling up. "Sub-level engineers!" The medic didn't waste time on pleasantries. He grabbed Chloe by the arm, peeling her away from Arthur. She didn't resist. She just let herself be guided onto the gurney. A second medic immediately began strapping her down, running a scanning wand over her pupils. "Shock, extreme dehydration, possible internal hemorrhaging from kinetic displacement," the scanner operator rattled off, pulling a thick IV line from a sterile pack. "Take her to Bay 7, push fluids and sedate." "Wait!" Arthur reached out, his hand grasping empty air, as they pushed the gurney away. "Is she going to be okay? What about the boy, Miller? He lost his leg." "Step back, sir," the burly medic said, blocking Arthur's path. He wasn't aggressive, just entirely dismissive. "He's in surgery. You're holding up the lane." The medic shoved a heavy plastic water bladder into Arthur's chest and pointed a thumb toward a yellow line painted on the steel deck. Follow the yellow line to processing, strip your gear, hit the decon showers, and wait for a quartermaster. Before Arthur could reply, the medic turned on his heel and jogged toward another dropship, touching down 50 yards away. Arthur stood alone in the organized chaos, clutching the water bladder. He was a ghost, an insignificant data point in a military machine that spanned star systems. He took a slow, agonizing sip of the water. It was cold, chemically purified, and tasted like heaven. To his right, a heavy thud caught his attention. Griggs was standing near a stack of empty munitions crates, his heavy armored gauntlets unlatched and resting on top of a barrel. The sergeant was pulling his helmet off. Without the thick, ablative plating covering his head, Griggs looked remarkably frail, deeply human. His hair was matted with sweat, and the deep scar on his jaw stood out pale against the flush of his skin. He pulled a crumpled pack of synthetic cigarettes from a pouch, clamped one between his teeth, and lit it with a heavy brass lighter. Arthur walked over to him. His boots felt heavy, as if the ship's artificial gravity was dialed up too high. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of what to say. Thank you felt entirely inadequate, a pathetic offering for a man who had waded through alien slaughter to drag them out of hell. Griggs exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke, not looking at Arthur. He watched a crane hoist a damaged fighter jet into the upper gantry. "We lost 40 people down there," Arthur said, the words slipping out of his mouth before he could stop them. His voice broke, the cynical, pragmatic shell finally cracking under the weight of the day. "In the lower levels, the vents collapsed. They were just trapped in the dark." Griggs took another drag of his cigarette. The cherry burned bright orange in the dim corner of the hangar. "I know," the Marine said, his voice flat, gravelly. "Command registered the life signs fading before we hit orbit." Arthur stared at him, feeling a sudden cold knot tighten in his chest. "You knew they were alive, and you just glassed the grid?" Griggs finally turned to look at Arthur. His bloodshot eyes were devoid of pity, devoid of malice. They were just tired, a deep geological exhaustion that seemed to reach the marrow of his bones. "Chief, there were 10,000 Varrock breeding in the lower mantle of that rock. If we spent 3 days digging through the rubble to find 40 corpses, this ship wouldn't be able to rearm and jump to the next distress beacon." Griggs flicked a flake of ash onto the steel deck. "We didn't come here to save your friends. We came here to kill the things that ate them." The brutal, unvarnished honesty of it felt like a physical slap. Arthur wanted to argue, to scream about the value of human life, to demand justice for the miners who had suffocated in the dust. But as he looked around the colossal, filthy hangar bay, at the scarred armor, the missing limbs, the exhausted faces of the crew, the argument died in his throat. Humanity wasn't surviving because it was morally superior. It wasn't winning the galaxy through diplomacy or noble sacrifice. It was surviving because it was willing to build flying fortresses of absolute devastation. It was surviving because men like Griggs were willing to treat planetary annihilation as a mathematical equation. "Processing is down the yellow line," Griggs grunted, turning back to watch the crane. "Take a shower, Chief. You smell like dead meat." Arthur didn't reply. He turned and began a slow, limping walk down the faded yellow line painted on the steel floor. He was alive. He had a future. But as the heavy blast doors of the processing sector hissed open, swallowing him into the sterile, metallic bowels of the warship, Arthur knew a part of his soul had been left behind in the dark, buried under a mile of glassed rock. They were safe, but they would never truly be rescued. Decontamination was not a gentle process. The heavy, pressurized doors sealed shut behind Arthur with a definitive, airtight hiss, locking him in a stark, white, hexagonal room that smelled aggressively of bleach and ionized oxygen. An automated, synthesized voice crackled from a hidden speaker, ordering him to strip and place all personal items in the biohazard incinerator chute to his left. Arthur's fingers were stiff, the joints aching with a dull, throbbing intensity as he fumbled with the clasps of his rig. He unzipped his heavy canvas jacket. It was stiff, entirely saturated with dried hydraulic fluid, gray silicate dust, and the dark, crusting blood that belonged to Miller, to the Varrock, to the butchered miners of Sub-Level 2. He peeled it off his shoulders, his muscles screaming in protest, and dropped it onto the grating. It landed with a heavy, wet slap. He stripped away his shirt, his boots, his reinforced trousers. Stripped bare, the frigid air of the room bit into his skin, raising goosebumps across his bruised, battered flesh. He looked down at himself. He was covered in a mottled map of purpling contusions, shallow lacerations, and a thick layer of grime that made his pale skin look grey. He felt frail. He felt like a hollowed-out shell of a man, stripped of the mechanical armor and tools that had defined his entire adult life. He kicked the pile of ruined clothing into the steel chute. A heavy blast door snapped shut over it, followed instantly by the muffled, deep whoomp of a plasma incinerator. The physical evidence of his time on Aegis Prime was reduced to carbon and ash in 3 seconds. The shower engaged without warning. Scalding, high-pressure water blasted from dozens of jets set into the walls and ceiling. Arthur gasped, instinctively curling inward as the heat burned his raw skin. The water was laced with a harsh, foaming chemical detergent that stung his scraped knuckles and burned his bloodshot eyes. He didn't step back. He stood directly in the center of the punishing deluge, letting the pressurized streams beat against his neck and spine. He watched the water swirl around the heavy brass drain at his feet. It ran pitch black at first, thick with the soot and ash of the orbital bombardment. Then it turned a muddy, rusted brown, diluting the grease and sweat. Finally, it ran pink, washing away the organic remnants of the nightmare. Arthur closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the cold, wet steel of the bulkhead. He wanted to cry. He had expected a massive, cathartic release of emotion, a breakdown of tears and shaking sobs, but nothing came. His tear ducts felt as dry as the glass surface of the planet they had just left. The trauma had burned out his emotional fuses, leaving him with a quiet, hollow numbness. He scrubbed his skin with a coarse synthetic sponge provided in a wall dispenser, scrubbing until his skin was raw and bright red, desperately trying to wash off a feeling of profound dirtiness that had settled deep in his bone marrow. When the water finally shut off, a blast of warm, dry air cycled through the room. Arthur dressed mechanically in the grey ship-issue fatigues, sitting in a sterile vacuum bag on a bench. The fabric was rough, highly durable, and smelled faintly of anti-static chemicals. They were a size too large, bagging at his waist and ankles, making him feel like an imposter in a uniform he hadn't earned. He followed a series of blinking green arrows down a labyrinth of narrow, dimly lit corridors. The sheer mass of the dreadnought was omnipresent. The deck vibrated with a continuous, low-frequency hum of massive fusion reactors. The bulkheads were scarred, patched, and repatched, speaking to decades of relentless, brutal service in the dark corners of the galaxy. The arrows deposited him in a vast, utilitarian mess hall. It was packed with hundreds of men and women in identical grey fatigues or half-stripped combat armor. The noise was a dull, overlapping drone of hushed conversations, the scraping of cheap metal cutlery against plastic trays, and the ambient hum of the ship. No one was laughing. No one was celebrating a victorious campaign. They were just eating, fueling their bodies for the next drop, the next slaughter. Arthur grabbed a tray from an automated dispenser. A thick dollop of grey synthetic nutrient paste was dropped onto the plastic, followed by a metallic cup of lukewarm water. He found an empty seat at the end of a long steel table. He took a bite. It tasted like damp cardboard and heavy salt. It was the most incredible thing he had ever eaten. His starved stomach cramped violently, then eagerly accepted the calories. He ate methodically, scraping the tray clean, chewing on the terrible, life-saving paste while staring blankly at the scarred surface of the table. A klaxon blared overhead, 3 short, aggressive bursts. "All hands, brace for slipspace transition," the ship's PA system announced. It wasn't the dramatic voice of a heroic captain. It was the bored, nasal tone of a navigation officer reading from a checklist. "Transition in 10 seconds. Arthur stopped chewing. He looked up, spotting a small, heavily reinforced viewport at the far end of the mess hall. Beyond the thick glass, the endless, indifferent black of the Perseus Veil stretched out, punctuated by the cold, distant light of a million uncaring stars. The deck shifted beneath his boots. It wasn't a sudden acceleration. It was the nauseating, reality-bending pull of the ship's FTL drive, tearing a violent hole in the fabric of space-time. The stars outside the viewport didn't streak into beautiful, cinematic lines of light. They violently snapped, warping into a chaotic, blinding swirl of Cherenkov radiation that made Arthur's eyes ache. The dreadnought didn't slip into the void. It hammered its way through, brutal and unyielding. Arthur looked around the mess hall. None of the crew had stopped eating. None of them had even looked up. This violent tearing of physics was just another Tuesday. He sat back in his uncomfortable metal chair, resting his clean, shaking hands in his lap. He thought of Chloe, lying sedated in a sterile tube. He thought of Miller, waking up to find his leg gone, replaced by the harsh reality of biofoam and prosthetics. He thought of Griggs, smoking a cigarette while standing on a mountain of pulverized rock and human remains. Humanity wasn't a beacon of light in the dark. They were the monsters you called when the other monsters broke down your door. Arthur took a sip of his lukewarm water, feeling the steady, thrumming heartbeat of the warship beneath him. He was alive, and for the first time in his life, he understood exactly what that cost. Survival isn't pretty, and the void doesn't care about your feelings. If this raw look into the brutal reality of human resilience kept you on the edge of your seat, Smash that like button. It's the only way to keep the comms array online. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next time humanity brings the sledgehammer to a knife fight. Share this transmission with your squad and drop a comment below telling us what you think Griggs's next target should be. The galaxy is dark, but our artillery is louder. See you in the next drop.